Gentlemen, we're about to begin our next session, the book launch for Muniza Shamsi's book, Hybrid Tapestries, The Development of Pakistani Literature in English. The speakers for this session are Ghazi Salahuddin, David Waterman, Muniza Shamsi herself, and Framji Minwala, who will be joining us shortly. The moderator for this session is Aisha Tammy Huck. Aisha is a barrister by profession with degrees in law from the London School of Economics, University of Kent, and Gray's in UK. For the past 22 years, she has been a media personality. She hosts the TV program 24/7 on Business Plus. As a member of the Vision 2020 think tank of the Government of Pakistan, Aisha has worked on policy and governance matters.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Would you just take a second and switch off your cell phones? Because the last session I was in, the phones kept going off and they were very distracting. So if you just turn them onto silent, that would be great. Well, thank you all for being here at this session. Framji Minwala will be joining us in a second. Muniza told me about this book. She said it was the result of a journey that she had embarked on many years ago, which was further propelled when she started doing book reviews and literary criticism or interviews for The Dawn. This was also a time when Pakistani and Indian writers were making themselves known internationally in the fields of English writing and in particularly in the field of fiction. And for Pakistan's Golden Jubilee, Muniza had compiled a retrospective of about 44 writers of Pakistani origin in her book, A Dragonfly in the Sun, which is really a lovely book. It's an anthology of Pakistani writing in English. This was followed by Leaving Home Towards a New Millennium, a collection of English prose by Pakistani writers, Pakistani women writers. And this raised the question, why were all these women writing in English, which brought us to where we are now, to Hybrid Tapestries, the development of Pakistani literature in English. So on the panel today, we have a really wonderful panel, and as soon as Framji arrives, it'll be complete. But we have with us Muniza Shamsi, who is an author and critic and the author of this book that we're discussing today. We have David Waterman, a professor at the University of La Rochelle in France. And David says La Rochelle is the most beautiful city in France. And Ghazi Salahuddin, who is, I don't think anyone needs an introduction to Ghazi. He's a journalist extraordinaire. And then we have Framji Minwala, who will be joining us. He's a professor at Habib University. So I want to start with asking Muniza to talk a little about her book and her work and how she's come here today with this book. I understand it'll be on sale soon. There's some hitch with the shipment, but it should be here soon. It's a really fabulous piece. I mean, I've looked at it, I've read some of it, quite a lot of it actually. And I hand you over to Muniza now.
Thank you, Tammy. And with big thanks to Amina Sayed. Is the microphone not on? Hello?
Yes.
Is that? Oh, hello? Can you hear me now? Big thanks to OUP and Amina Sayed, who published this book, and all the wonderful editors and designers who worked with me on it. I started to write this book because I felt that first as a reader and then as a journalist and then as an anthologist, as Tammy has said, I had witnessed the development of Pakistani English literature and had collected quite a lot of information. I thought this would take about 2 or 3 years, but in fact it took about 10, because the more I read, the more material I found. To give but one example, I soon realized that the early Pakistani English writers like Atiya Faizi, Samuel Faizi Rahmin, Ahmad Ali, and Shahid Surawardi had started their literary careers in the pre-partition era. You know, is this working? Is this working? Or should I hold it? Or should I hold it? Oh, I see. Okay. Thank you. So Yes, so they had started their literary careers before partition. And it became important to look at the circumstances under which this writing developed. This took me back to colonial and indeed pre-colonial times. Then Pakistani English drama had developed almost entirely in the diaspora. So there were a lot of gaps there that I had to fill in and look at the history of different theatre companies which originally provided a platform for Hanif Qureshi, Rukhsana Ahmed, Ayub Khan Deen, and others. In defining a Pakistani writer, I have always used the term to include anyone who claims that identity because I believe that influences perceptions and literary output. For example, the British-born Hanif Qureshi strongly asserts his Britishness, but on the other hand, he constantly refers to his Pakistani heritage. He discusses his father alongside his uncle Umar Qureshi, the journalist, the Pakistani journalist. And in one novel, he slips in intertextual references to the poetry of his aunt Maki Qureshi.
Okay, you can't be heard.
I can't be heard.
Can someone fix this mic, please?
Well, it seems to be coming and going, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What?
They
can
can't
hear.
hear.
They say they can. Shall I hold
Inka
it?
mic, मेरा नहीं, इनका mic.
ये
इनका
वाला।
position ठीक कर दे mic का.
Will it help? It's closer to.
If
But
I
you would
hold
just want
it,
to hold it.
मुझे दे दीजिए, मैं पकड़ लेती हूँ. Yeah. Okay, is that better? Yes, I think it is. Yes, so, where was I? I was talking about, yes, Pakistani English literature. Well, most people, when they talk about Pakistani English literature today, they talk about fiction, award-winning fiction writers like Babsi, Sidwa, Muhammad Hanif, H.M. Naqvi, Mohsin Hamid, Danyal Moinuddin, Uzma Aslam Khan, and Kamla. But in fact, contemporary Pakistani English poetry of a very high standard developed much before fiction, though it is comparatively little known. And Pakistani English literature is such a diverse body of work that this book covers poetry, fiction, drama, memoirs, letters, and essays. Also, I discovered that there were many valuable sources that were often discussed, which are not often discussed in Anglophone literary criticism, such as the collected English writings of Faiz Ahmed Faiz, which provide fascinating insights into the impact of the East-West encounter on Urdu literature and English literature. Conversely, I found that many of the critical writings in Western academic journals were not available in Pakistan. Hybridity, the blending of influences, is central to all South Asian English writing. And among Pakistani English writers, there are also many translators. So I have actually included Pakistani translations by quite a lot of these writers because they stand as creative work in their own right. I found, for example, that Shahid Surawardi's translations of Chinese poetry were influenced by those of Ezra Pound. Tawfiq Rafat's essay in translating Bulle Shah from an older oral Punjabi tradition has a fascinating resonance with Seamus Heaney's discussion on translating Beowulf from the Anglo-Saxon. Some of Imtiaz Dharkar's feminist poetry has a clear resonance with that of Fehmida Riaz and Kishwar Nahid. Of course, I've given considerable space to language and linguistics and the struggle to express in English the nuances of the subcontinent. Anyway, while I was working on this book, so many English language writers of Pakistani origin began to emerge in such rapid succession, including novelists Azhar Abadi and Wayne Ashton in Australia, Aqila Ismail in the UAE, Shahryar Fazli in Pakistan, and the playwright Ayad Akhtar in America, that I decided I really had to have a cutoff date. 2011, which marks the end of the first decade of the new millennium, which saw Pakistani English literature firmly established as the dazzling new star in the Anglophone literary world. And though I went on to discuss new trends, new books, new directions in the concluding chapter, I think I'm going to end now and I hope you enjoy the book when you get a copy.
Thank you, Muniza. David, your thoughts on the book? I know you're mentioned in the bibliography.
Yes, I am. As soon as I heard that I was mentioned in the bibliography, I said, this has to be published. So. Well, first of all, it's a great honor to be here and to be invited to participate in the panel for the launch of Muniza's book. And I'm delighted to do that, but it's a problem too, because what do you say when you're talking about Muniza Shamsi that you don't already know? You already know her long list of accomplishments and the fact that Muniza knows everybody in Pakistani literature, and that everyone knows Muniza, and if you know her, you can get in touch with almost anybody else, right? And so, as I read the book, it became clear to me that Muniza's book will become an important contribution to Pakistani Anglophone literature across many different genres. And I know that's true because as I read it, I was struck by how many things I didn't know when I read it, and I learned quite a lot just in a first reading. Hybrid, in other words, not pure. Anytime anybody tells us that they have found pure origins, it's either because they haven't looked closely enough or because they have a political agenda to accomplish. But we're not only talking about hybrid tapestries in terms of different cultural and linguistic influences, but political as well, political in its largest sense. Muniza already said that she's taken as her scope as Pakistani anybody who claims that identity. And that's just as it should be. Pakistani, yes, but with resonances that go well beyond Pakistan. Why do I say political? Well, think about it. During the civil rights movement in the United States, blacks had to come together as blacks in order to advance their political agenda. And yet, there were resonances of that agenda that went well beyond the black community. We could say the same thing for the women's rights movement, all right? Women had to come together as women in order to accomplish political objectives, but with resonances that involved other people beyond just the women's movement. And Pakistani writing across many different genres has to do a similar thing, I think. It has to advance as Pakistani writing in English, yet, as we all know, it resonates globally now. I don't even know how many translations there are outside of English, but the current generation of Pakistani writers is doing very well on the world scene. Now, fiction writers, and we've heard this over and over here at the conference, they don't necessarily want to adopt that mantle of political agenda in their work. They would prefer to talk about the artistic accomplishment, the narrative, the story. You've heard that over and over, right? See, this is why writers don't like to hang around with me. It's because they want to talk about art, and I'm too thick to understand art. And so, we're not always on the same page. Now, I won't claim that these writers have a political agenda. I would never claim to be inside someone's head and know what their motivation is. That's too arrogant for me to do. But instead of talking about art, I would prefer to talk about what I call, after Serge Moscovitzi's, social representations. In other words, literature as an integral part of the historical archive, a product of its time and place, a possible world. Now, just saying Pakistan brings a lot of baggage along with it, much of it political. And Pakistani writers, whether they like it or not, enter that context, that ongoing debate, to a certain degree. And Muniza's book does an excellent job of taking into account that political hybridity as part of the tapestry, along with all of the other hybrid elements, cultural, linguistic, social, psychological, and as such, provides us with several different theoretical lenses with which to examine Pakistani Anglophone literature as it continues to develop in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David. So, Ghazi, your thoughts. I know that Ghazi, by the way, before we got here, he said, I'm only going to say how wonderful the book is in 25 different ways, and I'm going to see if the audience can figure that out.
Yes.
So now I've spoiled it for him, so Ghazi, you'll have to do something else.
No. First, thank you, Tammy. I don't know if I look like one, but I think I am an intruder in this place. Because I look at myself as an Urdu medium person, truly. But in that sense, I make this panel hybrid. The only thing I would like to say, and that is an important statement, that it's a great, very impressive, remarkable work that Muniza has done. She said she has spent 10 years on it. It shows, and it gives you in one book the entire spectrum of English literature writing in Pakistan, even from pre-Pakistan, British India days. And it introduces you to writers that you may not have heard about, and then when you read about them, you may want to read them. So in that sense, it is a book that can enlarge your knowledge of Pakistani literature in English, enlarge your sense of what is being done in this area in Pakistan. But because I'm a journalist, so I tend to ask questions rather than make statements. So, and since Muniza is here, and she's the author, so we can even consider this as some kind of a conversation with the author. And what worries me and what I think I keep thinking about is that, as she said, there has been a surge of writings in English in recent years. There have been new names and all that. Is it because of the dominance of English in our society? Or is this being written for a foreign audience? And what this upsurge, or what this wonderful kind of output in English, what does it say about the collective creativity and sense of intellectual vigor of the society? Does it represent something that is happening across, or does it represent something which is happening in isolated places? This is something that I would like Muniza to share her thoughts.
So that's supposed to be my job, Ghazi. I'm also supposed to just ask the question.
You are the boss.
You're supposed to
Tammy,
give. You're supposed to.
You are the boss.
No,
okay.
you're supposed to give me the fodder to ask the questions. No, but those are great. No, those are great questions. So, Muniza, you want to jump in and talk about?
You can rephrase the question.
No, I wrote them down so I can repeat them verbatim. No, so if we could talk about the whole issue of English, the English language, the use of the language, and foreign audiences, and then what Ghazi just said about what this says about our collective intellectualism, or lack thereof.
Oh gosh, that's a kind of tough question. Actually, there are a lot of things involved here. You know, when Babsi Sitwa wanted to publish her early work, she was told when she sent it to American publishers, she was told it was too distant in time and place, and that nobody wanted to read about this remote land. And there was a great upsurge of Indian English writing at that point. Actually, there were a lot of things that happened, and which are responsible for this. One of them was in Western academia, they started a new discourse. That discourse said that the new literature was not just from the Anglo-American norm. We're talking about the 60s and 70s. They started talking, and there are different phrases, post-colonial Commonwealth, whatever you call it, and they keep debating about it. But in academia, they started saying that the new work is coming from Britain's erstwhile colonies. They started looking at literature from Africa, from India, from different countries. And they, in the 60s, the conversation that used to go on was, is the novel dead? And then with that, they followed, and they started to find new work and new writing from different countries. And that created an interest in this part of the world. But at first it was Indian English literature, and I think they were quite prolific, actually. We just had Babsy, and then Sarah Soleri, and so on. And then it is partly due to the response of publishing. Of course, Pakistan then became the center of world politics, but that was sort of 90s, 2000. Then everyone knew where it was, and they were interested. But you know, there's a conversation that goes on that all these English writers, they just write about 9/11 to make the Americans happy. That is actually not quite true. They write about a lot of things. They write about domestic things. They might not get the same kind of publicity because that's something the West is interested in. More writers in the new millennium have written about 1971, I think almost as much, if not more, than they have 9/11. What this says, the other thing that has changed is our travel restrictions. We don't have, in the old days, you know, you used to have the P form. It was such a nightmare to go abroad. You couldn't get news from there. Now we've got internet access. That is in English. I think that makes a big difference. You have websites where people can post their creative work. They get feedback from other writers. So I think that the other thing is that you get a lot of people like Mohsin Hamid and Usman Aslam Khan, so on, Bina Shah, whose parents lived abroad. Then they came back to Pakistan. They went abroad, and they went to universities abroad. So there started being a kind of interchange between, and then you got writers in the diaspora. This is the other myth, that it is the writing of the elite. Well, it was once, because only a certain class learnt English. But what has happened in the diaspora, whether you're elite or non-elite, you're still a marginalized person. You don't have a voice. And and that's not just Pakistani writing. There's this entire body of work, whether it's African writing or Indian English writing. It speaks from the margins, and within those margins, of course, you've got migrant communities, and you've got people like Nadeem Aslam, you've got Tariq Mahmood, you've got Ayub Khandin. They're writing working class literature. What happens is that when that literature comes to Pakistan, because to a large extent English is still considered the domain of the professional classes, then people kind of look at it and say, what is this writing? I mean, this is not how we are. Because we are is because we belong to a certain class. We don't quite accept that working class experience. That is something else. It's got not to do with the authenticity of the experience they express. I haven't entirely answered your question, which can spend me for a whole hour. But
thank you for this. Yes.
But you touched on the whole issue of colonial literature and then post-colonial literature. So how's the evolution been? You know, if you start, say, before partition with Indian English writers, and then you move into Pakistani English writers, and then Pakistani English writers today, were quite different, as you just mentioned, from the writings, say, of the 60s. What has the evolution been? And
well, you see, before partition, there was this whole issue of English. It was used as a language. It was originally used as a language of communicating with the Raj, for jobs, for employment, for making the Indian point of view. It became the language of parliament, and all this non-fiction was an acceptable part of the Indian English writing. What actually happened was in the 19th century, they had started introducing English literature into schools. And I've recently done some more reading on this, and that contact with English literature, which began in Bengal, profoundly influenced the vernacular literatures of this part of the world. I didn't know this, but according to Meenakshi Mukherjee, the people who wrote in English and the people who then became and revolutionized Bengali, they were all people from the same class. They all came from these English medium schools. So what happened was this, they went into their own languages where they made a profound difference with the contact with English. The Indian English writers, or the Indo-Anglian as they were called, they kept struggling and how to get a voice and how to express it, and they tried to write like the Orientalists, and all this carried on. Then what happened was that in about 1930, with the independence movement, you get people like Ahmad Ali and Mulk Raj Anand, and they move away from trying to copy the Orientalists, and they start experimenting and trying to write about India, and they are also, unlike an earlier generation, anti-British. They are very nationalistic. And so, again, English was a way of communicating our point of view to the British. And this concept carried on even in the 60s. You know, you wrote, in the 60s it was very difficult. It was a very isolated period for Pakistani English literature. We couldn't communicate with the Indians. We couldn't have access to anyone abroad. So they, and again, there was this notion, and this persists, you know, when Pakistani English writers write something that people perceive as sort of negative, they say, well, you're presenting a bad image of the country to the outside world. But the person who's using English as his own language, because of it's his first language or whatever, he's writing the world as he sees it, and if he's going to use it as a polemical tool or as a public relations exercise, then his writing loses something. And quite honestly, what have you got a sort of Ministry of Information for, you know?
But you know, when you talk about image, fiction is fiction. Where does image come into it? You know, so Ghazi, I mean, you're a journalist.
Yes.
Why should image play such an important role in writing? I mean, if you're writing fiction, you're writing fiction.
No, when you're writing fiction, you are giving people a deeper understanding of reality. Because fiction is about real lives, and I think creative writers understands the word better than journalists like me, or even the talk show hosts. And no. I mean the general.
Yeah.
No, you're not. You're present company
okay.
excluded.
I'll live.
So I think fiction, even when it is fantasy, has more reality than any other kind of writing.
But doesn't it give you license to do more stuff if you're writing fiction or fantasy? It gives you license to play with things.
Why not?
Well, sure it does. If you're an historian, for example, and you're writing your paper about what really happened for this or that event, you're supposed to stick to the archive, right, and find proof of what really happened. Whereas if you're writing fiction about that event, you can do things that the historian can't do. You can psychologize characters. Yes. You can go into their heads and say what they're thinking, see what their motivations are, the kinds of things that don't exist in the historical archive. And you're able to...
May I give an example? Mm-hmm. Who would tell you more about the industrialization in England than Dickens? Mm-hmm. Who can interpret for you the madness of the communal riots than Munto?
Mm-hmm. And
who can tell you about the situation and the what was happening during 1857 better than what Ghalib has done in his letters and in his poetry?
No, and then we have Hanif and the exploding mangoes. Who
yes.
knows what happened? You know, he invented this wonderful, witty, funny book. You know, and with sort of shades of reality and fantasy.
It's fiction, but it's not necessarily false.
Yes.
But and the other thing you can do with fiction too is you can treat. Well, you were talking about the working classes earlier, and with fiction, oftentimes working class people, women's experience, those things were not recorded in the historical archive. It was great men and their great battles, right? When you write fiction, you can treat those marginalized categories too. You don't have necessarily an obligation to find proof of that in the archive.
Absolutely.
About, Tammy, may I sort of a little digression perhaps? When you mention Hanif's case of exploding mangoes, another question that I think about is whether in Pakistan, more people are writing reading literature in English or in Urdu or regional languages. So what I did was I did an experiment. This was 3-4 years ago. I searched out one major Urdu novel and tried to find out how many copies of that novel had been sold in Pakistan. And it had been sold half the copies of A Case of Exploding Mangoes. I don't know what does it say, but that's what it is.
Well, can I just comment about Amtu Hanif's novel again? I was asked to give a talk on Pakistani English literature to a whole lot of medical students. Now, they're both conversant in both languages. And the only book any of them had read was Exploding Mangoes. So I don't know what that says, whether this is a linguistic thing or whether it's just this book has so captured the imagination of so many people.
It says we're all Democrats. I think.
No, but Exploding Mangoes was read all over. I mean, it's true that when you write in English, you have a global audience. And Pakistani writers are recognized, those who write in English. And again, as an aside, let me tell Muniza Shamsi, the New York Times has this a weekly section by the book in which they ask an author what books he or she has been reading and what authors they like. And what was published here in the New York Times International Edition yesterday, an author, Ali Smith's interview, and she was asked what major writers of today you like. And there is a small list, and there is Kamila Shamsi in it.
Well, that's made my day.
That's wonderful. We're going to welcome Framji onto the stage.
It was yesterday. And now we can hand it over to Framji.
No, you can't. I've just been sitting for 1 hour in that silly line trying to park my car. Hi.
Hi.
I have a question.
Okay.
I have a question specifically about...
You're not meant to ask a question. That's my job. You can make a comment about the book first.
I think this is a really important book.
It's been said.
It's been said.
I'm sure it has been said.
You're late.
I think I don't know whether this has been said, but the work of researching, going through archives, documenting, and laying out in the categories you have, the developments that you have noted, I think those are crucial for subsequent researchers, because my sense is that your book will serve as a reference for almost all of us who will then do subsequent and the kinds of academic scholarly work. This will be hugely useful. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for those nice.
And I think it should be prescribed in the English literature classes in all Pakistani universities.
It should be as a reference work, yeah.
Thank you.
No, it's important to have a reference book. And are there any other reference books like this? I mean, do we have anything like this? This is the first one of its kind.
Of this kind, yes. And with the kind of bibliographical documentation, the unearthing of narratives and texts that I don't think other people have noted, and the extension into the diaspora, which I think is very important.
So you can ask your question now, Fran.
Thank you. So I remember, Auntie Muniza, talking to you almost 3 years ago now, about the drama parts of this, right?
Okay. Gosh, yes.
Yeah. And we had this discussion about the work that was happening in the diaspora, some of which I knew and some of which I really didn't know, mostly the US work and some of the UK work. But it seems to me that one of the things that you have touched on and the distinction you make in the chapter is really between a written dramatic tradition and a performance tradition. And I think that the performance, there is quite a lively performance tradition in Pakistan, as there has been in South Asia for almost 2,000 years. And I think, one of the things that you have noted elsewhere in the book, but not necessarily here in the book, is that part of the decline of a living theater tradition in Pakistan was at least partially a result of partition, because the traditions that extend all the way back into the 2nd, 3rd century BC are primarily a Sanskrit tradition and a Sanskrit performance tradition and a dance tradition. There's certainly a lively dance tradition still in Pakistan, but there is no dramatic tradition. You're absolutely right. And it is almost impossible to try and revive it. And this is the thing that I have had great difficulty with, that their writers are not really interested in writing for the theater anymore, here at least. They seem to want to write for television, they seem to want to write for fiction, poetry, films, but not for the theater. So my question really is, when you were researching and in your conversations with Zia Saab and other theater practitioners in Pakistan, what was their response to the fact that there is no living tradition? Not even in Urdu, not just not in English, but not even really in Urdu.
I didn't actually have conversations with Zia on this. I read his articles on the subject, which I've quoted. His articles on the news where he discusses this, and he also discusses this in his memoirs. His thing was that in Urdu, at least, there was not much of a dramatic tradition in any case. And in the book I've mentioned that the one playwright in the 60s that we did have, and he was published thanks to Yunus Said. I mean, I stuck to published text because it was all getting very complicated. And for the whole book is anyone who has published a full-length book. I haven't gone into stray short stories or unpublished work. So he said that in Urdu the dramatic tradition was very limited. And yes, the one playwright we did have was Sayyid Ahmed. Now, Sayyid Ahmed belonged to Dhaka. Dhaka has got a much stronger dramatic tradition than we do. And drama is taught in schools, drama, music, dance. I knew a young Pakistani girl who was posted there. Her husband had a posting in Dhaka, and she said, you can hardly believe that they were the same country. The attitude towards the performing arts is so different. Over here, we're caught up in all kinds of confusions, and at times dance gets banned and it gets thrown in. But it was in Zia Haq era, and what a battle Shima fought to keep it alive. So it's a much larger thing. And with English, then there was this odd sort of crisis that, everybody speaks Urdu, so if we speak we have drama in English, then it's an elitist sort of thing. But everybody went on writing in English newspapers. There's these kind of bizarre contradictions, gray areas. And so it is a great, when you talk about drama tradition, we had in this country Shahid Surovardi. Shahid Surovardi had worked with Stanislavski. Can you imagine the great Stanislavski who introduced modern theater? He worked in Moscow. Shahid Surovardi directed plays at the Moscow theater. And then Stanislavski then left and went to America, and he introduced method acting to the Americans. Shahid Surovardi came to Pakistan, but there was no follow-up because there was all this confusion around theatre and the performing arts. Is it within? Does our religion around? There's always religion always gets thrown into it. I don't know why.
About drama, I am aware of some Pakistani origin Americans writing plays that were staged on Broadway. I remember two of those plays were reviewed in New York Times also. Would they belong here in this book, or in the gallery of Pakistani writers?
I would include them if I had known of them. Yes, but I looked only for published scripts. I couldn't. So I only had Wajahat Ali.
Stage, and I think one play did very well, which is about immigrants in America. Yes. Or something.
Well, there are a lot of plays also in England that have been staged but that have not been written, and I had to restrict myself to the written text.
Yeah. Yes, and Sayyid Ahmed, you rightly said, was
He belonged to Dhaka, and
The only one, Parab.
I think his father was involved in the theatre in Dhaka, and there was a link with the theatre in Calcutta.
Yes.
I mean, my sense is that, the challenge that you have set yourself in this chapter is that most dramatic works, texts, and a dramatic tradition emerges out of a performance tradition.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
And more often than not, the performance traditions are not scripted and not published.
Yeah,
right?
that is true.
Or published in, say, surveys or accounts of eyewitnesses, but not necessarily published as textual documents. So it's very difficult to actually assess drama and performance because there has been no archival or even eyewitness accounts in any comprehensive way. There have been sporadic accounts, but not necessarily a comprehensive survey or genealogy of performance in Pakistan post-partition, or even for that matter pre-partition.
No, that is true. I mean, I often wonder. You get Pakistani people, they often tend to, English language plays, they perform plays by British playwrights, but why don't they look at plays by Pakistani English playwrights that have been performed in the diaspora? Why would the experience of an immigrant in Britain not be relevant to a Pakistani audience? Why do you always go for, British or American playwrights?
You have no argument for me.
Any comment on that?
No?
I think it's a colonial tradition and the whole O-level, A-level thing. I think that has a lot to do with it, because when you go to school and you have to put on a school play, you're usually doing something by Oscar Wilde or whatever. So you wind up doing those kind of plays, and then if something is staged later on, it's either an English or an American playwright. But, you brought up something which I thought was a bit interesting, and that's 1971. So prior to 1971, how different was it? And post-1971, how did you see the landscape change in terms of Pakistani literature in English?
Oh, well, it wasn't really much going at that time. I mean,
Because before 1971, you had East Pakistan as well, so you had literature coming out of there.
Most of it, the drama came from there. Sayyid Ahmad's drama came from there. And that period actually marks a kind of that transition where a contemporary voice actually starts emerging in the 60s. I mean, there was Ahmad Ali's book in the 1940, and but the new voice came from Zulfikar Ghaus, which is in the diaspora. So that was not involved with 1971. You had poetry developing. That was Tawfiq Rafat and Adrian Hussain and Salman Qureshi. And these were these OUP anthologies. And they had this discourse on idiom. And that was carried across. And one of the people involved in that discourse was Sayyid Ali Ashraf, who was head of the English department at Karachi University. He belonged to Dhaka. So what was actually happening was that this literature was in its infancy. So there was a discourse happening, and one of the people, and I've mentioned him here, who did develop in Bangladesh, and who was, to this day in Bangladesh, they talk of Tawfiq Rafat and Kalim Umar with such warmth and such affection. But actually this literature hadn't developed. And it was in the 1960s, late 60s, 1970s, that it started to take off. And then, of course, you got the Zia era, and then everything begins to shut down again. But the difference there was that in Pakistan it starts shutting down, but in the diaspora, you suddenly start getting an interest in this kind of writing. So suddenly, the fiction writers, Babsi, Sarah Soleri, but she's a creative member, the fiction starts emerging, and they kind of escape the restrictions of the Zia regime, while the poets, because poetry has a small audience, were stranded with no publishing opportunities, no interest, etc. That's what happened.
We have about 12 minutes left, so I'd like to open this up to questions from the audience. Does anyone have a question? Do we have mics? The gentleman at the back.
Assalamu alaikum to all of you. I have some questions, so let me introduce myself. This is Khanzada Tawsif Alam. I'm a student at Namal University, National University of Modern Languages.
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
Literature and Linguistics. I'm doing at a university called Namal. I have a question, as the topic is all about like promoting Pakistani literature in English. I'm a teacher as well. I have taught English for 13 years. I have observed that in Pakistan, there are many hindrances and obstacles in terms of presenting literature in English, because people who are not good translators, they take it differently. Fine. I mean, my question is that how come can a person develop or maintain the same flavor of the literature, Pakistani literature, at the time of translating it into English and presenting it, maintaining the same level of discourse and style? One thing. And second is how come can people present the mysticism and Sufism, which forms the best part of Pakistani literature? These are my two questions to be entertained. Thank you.
Well, I think that two things. One of the things that most of this book deals with is English writing that is written originally in English. And that is what I mean by Pakistani English literature. I haven't gone into translation because that's a vast body of work. You've actually got, it's a problem of translation is a big problem. I know there's a school of thought which says you shouldn't translate Urdu because you can't get it right, in English, which is ridiculous, because if this was the theory, I would never have read War and Peace. Although my uncle, who could read Russian, tells me that after reading War and Peace in Russian, he didn't want to read another novel, and he certainly wasn't going to read it in English. So, there are these issues. But you have to... there is a development in translation. You are starting to get good translators. Sufism, Tawfiq Rafat has translated Bulleh Shah. Mahmood Jamal has translated an entire book of Sufi poetry in English. I mean, the Sufi poetry was in Urdu, but, or different languages. He has translated Sufi poetry. In fact, I think it's an anthology he's edited. He's a poet. Well, we're trying this. Well, okay, it's been fixed. So, I think there is this material. What you need to do is look for it. It's not well known often. I think Tawfiq Rafat's Bulleh Shah has been recently reissued. Mahmood's book should be available. So it's not really how to do it. It's a question of having access to it.
Demi, may I ask a question?
And then we have a gentleman here, and the second one.
Yes.
After Ravi.
So, Pakistani literature in English, it does have its own cultural identity, but how does it measure up globally in the global English literature scene? I know a few of the authors are very acclaimed, like Mohsin Hamid and Kamla Shamsi, but how do they measure up against global other authors, their contemporaries?
And add to this my question. I was hoping that we would have some kind of a comparison between Indian writers who write in English and Pakistani writers who write in English.
I think...
Well, Ghazi made that sort of gratifying comment about Kamla, so I think that says... she's my daughter, so it's a bit nepotistic, but I think you can take her as a representative of that generation. They are very highly regarded. You see, the prizes they're winning are international prizes. They're not winning prizes because they're from Pakistan or they're presenting a particular image, which seems to be another kind of notion we have. They compete against the best, and sometimes they win. And I've actually judged the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for 2 years. It was for the best book and the best first book, and the Pakistani contribution to that. In fact, one of our winners was Danyal Mohinuddin one year. So they are competing among the best, and that's why they're so highly regarded. Ghazi wants to know about the Indians. Well, the Indian developed earlier because I think they had, it's all got to do with because the Muslims of India learned English later than the Hindus. I mean, this is it is part of that whole historical trajectory. And the first major English language novel by a Muslim was by Ahmad Ali. In Bengal, in the Hindus, they'd been writing novels in English much before that. So the number of writers, and then even if you take Ahmad Ali's contemporaries, there was R.K. Narayan, there was Mulk Rajanand, there was Raja Rao, and then you got lots of others. And at partition, they got separated. And over here, really, the only outstanding novelist was Ahmad Ali and Shahid Surawardi. And then you kind of lost contact. So it developed later, but I think today, I think Pakistani writers and Indian English writers, a lot of them are also quite good friends, and I think they compare quite well. I don't think, I can't really see that comparison of one being better than the other. I think they're really, and they're reaching out to new horizons and doing new things.
Question. Hello.
Yours is mine.
No, the mic isn't working.
Oh dear.
Here.
I have a question.
Just a second, there's somebody behind you who had a question first. The lady at the back. Yeah. So no, I was just going to say Pakistani and Indian writers, if our governments got on a little better, we'd have better interaction and better participation at literature festivals as well.
I know.
Yes, have you got the mic? Yes.
Yes,
And then you.
thank you. Just want to ask, we ask the panelists one question, straight and simple. Would you consider this the most definitive book of writings of authors who are writing in English literature? Who are writing in English that Munisa has mentioned in her hybrid. And the other thing is that she just mentioned two authors, Surwardi and Rifat, was it? No. Ahmad Ali, post-colonial writers, but wasn't Atiya Hussain ever mentioned along with them as well? Okay.
Well, I'll take that. About a comment on my book, I can't comment, but we'll take Atiya Hussain because, as you know, she was my aunt. She was my father's first cousin, and she was married to my chacha. So she has a very direct link. But Aunt Atiya, and I come from a family which is divided, and my Aunt Atiya lived in Britain, but she was very determinedly Indian. She would not call herself Pakistani, and half the time she argued with my father for coming here. So she is an influence. She's in the book. She is a definite influence on, because her book Sunlight and the Broken Column has a kind of angle to our society. She recreates Indo-Muslim culture of the pre-partition era. She's compared and discussed in relation to Ahmad Ali. So she is very much there. But in the Pakistani canon, otherwise, it becomes confusing. The direct relationship, of course, is that her novel, Sunlight on a Broken Column, has a kind of very interesting, oblique kind of link to Kamla's second novel called Salt and Saffron, on which I have written a paper. It's a combination of memoir and literary criticism. It's called Sunlight and Salt, the Literary Narratives of a Divided Family, and where I kind of trace the matrix from which these two novels emerged. But Atiya Hussain I don't mention in relation to Ahmad Ali and Surawardi because they were here. They were contending. She was living in Britain, and she was, as I said, a part of the wider Indian diaspora. She was also part of the South Asian diaspora, so it's a bit complicated. He did indeed, a wonderful translation. yes, absolutely.
We have a question here.
Yeah, it's just a question with you. That don't you think we'll lose the essence once it's recreated, when it's being translated, the poetry of Bulleh Shah, whoever it is, if we translate it in English and we recreate it, don't you think we'll lose the essence of it?
Well, does he lose the essence? Well, this is what I was saying about translation. This is what I was saying about my uncle who's read War and Peace in Russian. Well, what can you say after that? So it's the same thing. A translator's craft is a very difficult craft, and that is why I have included poetry translations, because in a way, it is a creative work in its own right. And if you read Rafat, he will tell you the problems and of certain places. Actually, the work of his that I love above all is, which is not so well known, is his Puran Bhagat. I mean, I think it's just spectacular, this combination of Phaedra in a local Punjabi setting, and it's set in Sialkot. And it is the most, I think it should be performed. But you should just read it. Bulleh Shah was his first attempt. Puran Bhagat, he was more confident, and he describes the compromises he had to make. And Seamus Heaney describes the compromises he had to make when he was translating Beowulf, which was 10th century Anglo-Saxon. You see, so there is this issue, but we have to have translations, otherwise we wouldn't have access to a lot of good literature.
I think one of the ways in which you measure a thriving tradition is the degree to which writers themselves are willing to take narrative risks and experiment formally, and to conduct formal experiments which are take those narrative risks to audiences that are not necessarily prepared for them. So I think, and there's the younger generation of writers, I think, are taking fantastic narrative risks. I think it was Maslama Khan in her most recent book, Thinner Than Skin, did some really lovely experimental work with the bringing together of multiple narratives. Bilal Tanvir in The Scatter Here is Too Great, in working with the first person voice and how that voice functions. Mohsin Hamid's entirely second-person novel, How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia. And so I think, the novels that are emerging now are emerging out of a healthy and strong tradition. And so, Pakistani literature, South Asian literature, diaspora literature, however you want to describe it, is alive and experimenting and moving in new directions and new areas of experience. So I think it's good.
We have time for one more question. Is there a question? Yes. Could you give the mic to the gentleman at the back? Manisa. Manisa.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
I am Musawwar Hussain. I am doing a Masters in English Literature from University of Karachi. My question is from Ma'am Muniza Shamsi. Ma'am, have you talked about the future of English literature in the book? What would you think will be the future of English literature in Pakistan? And do you think English literature will completely dominate Urdu or Sindhi literature in Pakistan in the future? Thank you.
I've got the second half. What was the first half? I didn't get the
Future of English literature. Oh,
future
nice.
of English. Well, English literature being English literature by Pakistanis, you mean? Or English literature generally?
No, I think what he wants to know is, do you think English literature will dominate Urdu or Sindhi or local languages literature?
Well, no, I think they're rather strong languages, I mean, I can't see that happening. I can't, there's something to do with the strength of a language. Our literary traditions are very rich, and they have not been created in isolation. Urdu or Sindhi, they have all had some kind of contact with other languages, Arabic, Persian. You can't. I can't see that happening. I mean, it's there. Maybe get a. Then I think the number of English language writers in Pakistan is actually quite small compared to Urdu and other languages.
small, but definitely on the increase.
I mean, they're on the increase,
Yeah.
but I can't see other languages being threatened by English in that way.
Well, we've come to the end of this session, so thank you all very, very much. Many thanks to Muniza Shamsi, Qazi Salahuddin, David Waterman, and Framji Binwala. Came in late, but contributed hugely. Thank you all very much. Now the mics are working.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to announce that the book Hybrid Tapestries, you can place an order if you'd like to purchase. There's very few copies at the entrance, and if we run out, then we are taking orders and the books will be sent to you within a week, most likely. Okay? And this was the last session in this hall. Thank you very much.